See the feedback.
Okay.
Morning, everyone. Welcome back to the CWI Summer Conference. As you know, my name is John. I am the tattooed historian, and I'm so happy to be here with Jason Phillips. Thank you, Jason, for being on the live stream here on Facebook.
It's my pleasure, John.
Jason is the author of Looming Civil War, How 19th-Century Americans Imagined the Future. And he's also going to be speaking about John Brown's Pikes and material culture, and we're going to discuss that with you for about the next 10 or 15 minutes. So, again, thank you for coming on, Jason. And tell us about Looming Civil War. Tell us about your book.
So about 10 years ago, I read a sentence that we've all read before that said basically when the Civil War began, all Americans thought it was going to be short and fun and bloodless. It was going to be a frolic. And I guess I read that sentence one too many times and wondered to myself, who's actually studied this? Like, who's actually looked at letters and diaries and immersed themselves in newspapers from that crucial time period to understand how these Americans imagined the war before it happened? Mm-hmm. And when I kind of dug into this project, I realized that people in the 19th century understood the future and approached the future in a couple of ways. And they're not entirely similar to ours, at least not my way. I don't know how other people view the future, but one way that they understood the future, which I've considered pretty modern and kind of like myself, is they anticipated the future. And in that sense, they imagined that the future's in front of them and it's open. And they travel into the future each day of their lives, and they fashion their lives and the future in the process, right? So that point of view is very much about people make history. There's a lot of agency and free will in that concept. Mm-hmm. The other way of viewing the future still has the future in front of them, but these people imagine that instead of themselves traveling into the future approaches them day after day, kind of like waves crashing on a shore.
Okay.
And the most that they can do is kind of react to these external forces. Mm-hmm. And the future for them is therefore not open and malleable, but already made. Usually for these folks, it's already made by God.
So they're fatalistic.
So they're fatalistic, they're providential. Okay. They believe that the future is just unrolling itself. And the most they can do is react and pray and hope that they survive some cataclysmic event like the Civil War.
Right.
And so I say those people like expect the future, like they're kind of waiting for it to arrive, and they don't feel that they have a lot of control over it. And that point of view was very surprising to me, because even though I understood that 19th century Americans were very religious, I didn't know that it would affect the way they live their lives and understand time.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
And so when the Civil War was on the brink of happening, these two ways of understanding time affected the way people approached the future and imagined what the war would be like. So the anticipators are really amped up and excited for the war,
right?
Because they think they're going to make history.
Right. It's our turn.
It's our turn, and it's this is going to make our generation. This is going to remake our nation. Mm-hmm. If you're a secessionist, you believe obviously that you're going to become a founding hero of a new nation. Right. If you're an abolitionist, you see this as the moment for abolition. Mm-hmm. If you're a Republican, you think this is going to catalyze the party. This is going to strengthen the nation. So those folks are eager for kind of rushing into the war. Mm-hmm. And I think that's where this sort of short war myth comes from, this notion that everyone thought it was going to be fun, comes from these anticipators who were very enthusiastic about the war.
Right.
But there's another half to the story, and that's the people who are expecting the war. And they're not excited about this at all. And they feel that they've lost control over their lives, their daily lives. They've lost control over their family. Their family members are getting pulled away to the war. They expect that it's going to be long. It's going to be destructive. It's going to be out of their control, and it's going to be out of everyone's control. That the war is going to become this supernatural force or a force of nature. It's going to spin out of control, and not even the generals and the presidents are going to be able to handle it. Right. Which in some respects happens.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
So at the beginning, this kind of older, what to me anyway, at first was a weirder way of viewing the future, was a more appropriate way to understand the events that were unfolding. And it prepared those people who were expecting time to reach them to kind of handle the event. Not to say that they enjoyed it, of course,
Right.
But they were in a better mindset, a better frame of mind for dealing with it.
I was wondering how that came across as like almost an apocalyptic event for some people, where they're like, this is never going to end, it's going to keep going. And especially when you get into the time frame of where we're sitting now, and like it's now 1863, and they thought it'd be over in July of 1861, everybody be home by Christmas.
Right.
And now it's starting to turn into this, will this ever end kind of a thing. Does mindset change then?
It certainly does. And for the people who anticipated the war and thought it was going to be short and fun, it rocks their world when they realize that that time and the future is not going according to plan, and that they don't have control over things. So many of those volunteers who rushed into the military service in spring of '61, they discover that, even in camp, when it comes to drilling and Army regulations, they don't have the free will that they expected, right? And then, of course, once they get into combat, it's a whole other problem.
Right.
This is not what they imagined the seat of war to be like. They're eager to get to what they called the seat of war, which they thought was the heart of the conflict, and the guys who got there first were going to become heroes, and they were going to win the war. And once they get to the seat of the war, of course, it's chaos.
Right.
It makes no sense. Yeah. It's totally irrational and random, and they have no control over their own fate, let alone the fate of the country, which is what they thought they were rushing into, a chance to make history. Instead, history in the war is kind of remaking them and jeopardizing, everything that they had lived for to this point in their lives. You see it in Civil War music, right? So music switches from the marching tunes that are really popular in 1861, like John Brown's Body, to songs like Tenting Tonight, Home Sweet Home, like the more somber, slow tunes, the ballads that show that they're not racing into the future anymore. They're kind of waiting for the future to happen and wishing that they were in a different place.
Is this kind of an overarching theme too in conflict? Sometimes we see as longer conflict goes on, we see people being like, this is going to last a long time, and even though they may be a fatalist, they're like, my stuff is already signed. My contract is signed with God, and I'm just going to do whatever needs to be done. Do you see that in the mid-19th century?
Yes, I mean you do see a lot of what I guess we could call fatalism, especially as the conflict goes into its third year, when it's clear to people that even the presidents can't stop this conflict. Then people are thinking, well, maybe God is in control of this, and if God is in control of the entire conflict, then certainly God is in control of my fate. And it's already been sealed. So I just need to try to relax when I'm on the battlefield and recognize that either this is my day or it's not. So some people try to deal with that ontological crisis by resorting to talismans. Protection. There, a number of them, we'll talk about this afternoon when we talk about artifacts. A number of them take testaments and Bibles and put them in their breast pocket, hoping that that's like giving God a sign that they recognize that God is in control. But if I put this thing in front of my heart, maybe it'll stop a bullet. Right. So they're kind of like hedging their bets between anticipating and believing in free will and accepting providence and fatalism. And of course, many of those Bibles do stop bullets. I mean, when you've got millions of bullets flying around, some of them are going to hit Bibles.
I was going to say, we see them sometimes in museums.
Yes.
And it reinforces that narrative that they were saved by God. And all that.
Right. Yeah. And, where the bullet stops, it's going to stop on a particular page, a particular scripture. They usually find some special meaning in that. What is the verse where God stopped the bullet? And obviously that's a message for me.
Right.
So then, yeah, there's that expectancy, that notion that God has already designed my future and He's going to be sending me a message.
Does that also tie into the idea of the good death, where it kind of is like, hey, this is providence, this is my fate, and
Right.
it kind of ties into that?
Yes, and it definitely ties into the good death in the sense that men feel a need to prepare for their own demise, right? To prepare their souls for the afterlife.
Okay.
And focusing on the afterlife is it's a very expectant point of view. Right? It's a notion
Right.
that God and the future is and heaven or hell is something that's beyond my control. Whereas the anticipators, they're not. If they're focusing on life after them, they're focusing on utopia or dystopia. They're thinking about life on Earth among human beings after they're gone.
Okay.
Right.
Right.
Because that's kind of history unfolding by humans making it.
Right. Right. And speaking of someone who believes that this is providence and this is their way forward, we have to touch on John Brown while we're together.
Sure, let's talk about him.
Because John Brown stopped in my hometown of Chambersburg on his
He sure
merry
did.
way to Harper.
He had some helpers there.
He did, yeah.
Yes.
He met Douglas there and all
Yep.
that. John Brown's Pikes comes up sometimes, and I actually see random auctions sometimes where they'll say, "Oh, one of John Brown's Pikes is in this auction." Can you touch on the material culture behind those Pikes?
So, what we've been talking about seems very abstract, right? And I was surprised to find that before the Civil War, Americans grasped real things as tangible proof of a certain future unfolding, right? And one of those things, of course, was John Brown's pike. And these pikes, which for our listeners, were about 1,000 of them that were manufactured in Connecticut, sent south by John Brown, and eventually brought to Harper's Ferry. Most of them, not all of them, got there to be spread among slaves to create an army of liberation. When the raid failed, Southerners found these pikes and grasped them as war trophies, as symbols of the North's designs for the South, right? That these were manufactured in the North, they were paid for in the North. This is how the North intends to end slavery. And so there's a certain amount of intent behind the manufacturing of a weapon to use against other Americans.
It's evidence.
It's evidence, yeah. I mean, Exhibit A.
Right.
And so, because the raid failed fantastically, people wanted to kind of flaunt its failure by owning a pike. Edmund Ruffin grabbed 15 of them. He was a popular Virginia secessionist. And he sent one to each slaveholding governor and said, I want you to put this in the state legislature. And I want it to be there for when we secede and form the Confederacy. And it was. There was a John Brown pike in the legislative house where secession happened in South Carolina. They had to move it to Charleston, but yeah, that's where secession happened. A John Brown pike was present in the room.
Wow.
And these pikes kind of get circulated all over the country. Obviously, abolitionists, they don't see them as a sign of a crime or a piece of evidence against them. Instead, they see it as a sacred relic, especially after Brown is executed. And so they prize these pikes for very different reasons. William Lloyd Garrison ends up acquiring a pike and prizes it and points out that the seal of the state of Virginia has a slave, or what looks like a slave, standing over an oppressor wielding a pike. It looks exactly like a John Brown pike. So if you look up the Virginia state seal, there's a pike on it.
Yeah.
And so, yes, I mean, there's a lot about this pike story. And yes, they're still popular today. Once I got really into the deep story of these things, I looked how much it would cost to buy one. There are a lot of knockoffs, a lot of fake ones out there. You've got to be careful. But a real one costs around $10,000 or $15,000.
Wow.
Brown paid $1 per pike.
Yeah. Shows you how the symbolism behind it, and obviously too, there are only a few made. Relatively few.
Yes.
Compared to what we made of Springfield muskets or anything
Certainly,
like that.
Yeah.
That's awesome. And that's what you'll be talking about here at CWI later. You'll be talking.
Yes,
about
this
the
afternoon
Pikes?
I'll be talking about the pikes and their kind of their full story. How he decided to make them, where they were made. kind of following them around the country as different people gather them and collect them and use them for different political ends.
Awesome. Well, I thank you for joining us on the live stream, and tune in for more. And I want to repeat the name of Jason's book, which is Looming Civil War: How 19th Century Americans Imagined the Future. Tune in a little bit. We're going to have more interviews ahead.